Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco socialist program that I ran on with Angela Walker in 2020. So Biden gave his State of the Union address, and I'm going to give a response. Um, it was uh, pretty well. I think politically it was good for him because he had a rhetoric that was oriented to working class people, and I think he was effective with that. In contrast to the recent Democratic presidential presidents and presidential candidates who oriented toward the educated middle class, um, and you know that broadens the base of appeal for the Democratic Party. In fact, I think in that respect, it was the best speech Biden has ever made. 27.6 million people viewed it. They tend to be older, but I think receptive to that. And you wonder where that was during the midterms, because the Democrats only came within 6,675 votes spread across five very close House district races from keeping the majority of the House. And I think if that theme had been what the Democrats were leading with, they'd probably still have the House majority. So that was the overall picture he gave. And so it's not so much neoliberalism, public austerity, deregulation, privatization, but the old liberalism, the New Deal liberalism, where the government is activist. But it's still a corporate liberalism where uh, the corporations are still in charge. So it's really not a solution to our problems, but I think politically it was effective. But he started right off by calling for bipartisanship again with the Republican Party that tried to overthrow his election. Is busy now pushing laws in the states they control to suppress the vote and set it up so state legislatures they control, not the vote, can decide who's elected. And the way you fight fascism is not to cooperate with it and accommodate it; it's to fight it and defeat it. But that theme was running through his speech as well. So he started off and went most of the speech talking about the economy. And as I said, it was more the old-fashioned liberalism than the neoliberalism in rhetoric. And there were some good points in there, incentives for domestic manufacturing rather than offshoring. That's popular. We should have more our supply chains more rooted in our own economy here. He touted infrastructure, which is popular, and we need it. Although the amounts we have, and he didn't get into amounts, he just said we need to finish the job, is way below what's needed, according to forget the name of the association, but of engineers who grade our infrastructure every year. And it's also a lot in the wrong directions. I mean, we're still emphasizing roads rather than rails, for example, electrified rails. So, but anyway, the infrastructure was popular. I think the best point in the speech was he talked about protecting Social Security and Medicare. Um, and then, the Republicans, and he suggested that some of the Republicans want to cut those programs. And they heckled him. And he said, well, I'm not saying all of you, I'm saying some of you. And they heckled him. And I said, oh, so he said, so, oh, we agree. No cuts to Social Security and Medicare. And they were silent. The Republicans were silent. And so he basically took that issue off the table for the Republicans when they talk about deficit reduction. So he kind of did some political jiu-jitsu there and was nimble on his feet in a way he normally not is. And that was pretty good. But then he did go to talk about deficit reduction, which is the traditional fiscal conservative position of the neoliberal Democrats. And although he didn't spell it out this way, what it means is public austerity, not progressive tax reforms or military spending cuts, which is where the real money is, so that we can fund our social and environmental programs fully and still, not keep digging ourselves deeper deficits and a greater debt. He did come out for the PRO Act, that's Protect Our Right to Organize Act. It's a good labor law reform bill. He did say we need to restore the child tax credit, which was introduced during the COVID pandemic, and that was very effective at reducing child poverty. I think it cut it by about half. He talked about affordable child care and elder care, but again, didn't say how. But the way the Democrats do it is public subsidized for private delivery rather than doing it through public agencies at cost. So again, it's that corporate liberalism, not the kind of democratic socialism we would advocate. And he said we need more inspector generals, or they've brought the inspector generals back to fight corporate fraud, which, and he was very good at talking about how, corporations are ripping us off with hidden fees. And, that was good. But on the whole, it's still, through the corporate sector, doesn't deal with the fundamental problems. And one thing that would have been popular that he left out, which we need, is raising the minimum wage, which is still $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage. And then he turned to education, and he talked about universal preschool, which is good. He does have a bill that's being developed. Again, is that going to be as part of our public school system, or is it going to be that plus subsidizing private schools to deliver that? That's not yet clear. He said public school teachers need a raise, and the Democrats are preparing legislation to raise the minimum wage for teachers to $60,000 a year, which is a good idea. He didn't put a number on what the raise should be, but that's the bill that has yet to be introduced, but it's probably on the way. He said we need to reduce student debt, but didn't call for the full cancellation of that debt like we do. And again, he talked about free community college, one of his campaign promises, but not about tuition-free education at all public colleges. So it's a liberalism that is tepid, doesn't go all the way, not doing things like they do in Europe, like public colleges are tuition-free. And then he talked about healthcare and basically said we're beyond COVID. Of course, we're not. 3,500 people died last week from COVID, and the virus keeps evolving because of high transmission around the world where vaccinations and public health precautions are minimal. Now, the federal emergency measures that were instituted with the COVID pandemic expire on May 11th. That's what the Biden administration is doing. And one consequence of that is an estimated 5 million to 14 million people are going to be kicked off Medicaid. Once people are on Medicaid, they couldn't be taken off during the emergency. And that wide range for the estimate of how many will lose coverage is wide because each state is going to determine for itself who they're going to kick off. So it depends on what the states do. And meanwhile, COVID vaccine costs, we've talked about this, are going to quadruple for both Pfizer and Moderna from the $26 the government paid for this year to $130 per dose. And people that are not covered are out of luck. They're going to have to pay the higher price or probably be disincentivized from even getting the vaccination. And the copays of private insurance are going to be higher. He talked about a cancer moonshot, reducing the death rate from cancer by 50% in 25 years, which is great. But there's no specific program. I mean, the White House is appealing to private and public agencies to give their ideas on how to do that. But right now, it's more PR than a real program, at least to this point. Another good thing he said is he supported Medicare negotiating drug prices with Big Pharma. There's a little bit of that in legislation that passed that caps the cost of a limited number of drugs, including insulin. And he wants to go further. And that's good. But the problem is what he didn't talk about. He said nothing about Medicare Advantage, which his director for the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, Liz Fowler, the woman who was a former insurance executive who wrote the Affordable Care Act, which we know as Obamacare, which is a system of public subsidies for private health insurance. A major part of it is. And her goal, her stated goal, is to get everybody on Medicare and Medicaid into private programs, Medicare Advantage and other privately managed programs in Medicaid, which is a terrible idea because then, they get you on a Medicare Advantage and then they can deny you services or make you fight for services that ought to be covered. There was no commitment to universal health care, which even in the neoliberal period of the Democratic Party, they gave lip service to. And we're in a situation now where 8% of Americans have no coverage. It's 27 million people. And of course, what we advocate is not just national health insurance, Medicare for all, but a national health service, community-controlled, democratic, and covering all aspects of the healthcare system, not just the insurance side. And so, the healthcare situation is going to get worse with the repeal of the COVID emergency, and nothing was offered to expand healthcare coverage. Then he turned to climate and didn't say a whole lot. He did tout the Inflation Reduction Act, which does have some investments in clean renewable energy, but also a lot of permitting for increased oil and gas development. That's why I call the bill Build Back Badly. And Biden is still, at this point, has approved more drilling on public lands at a faster pace than Trump did. He talked about increasing the export of fossil fuels. At one point, he said we're going to need oil at least for another decade, which actually is true. In the transition, we're going to still be using oil, and got some heckling from the Republicans. And he said, oh, and beyond a decade. And really what the climate action, which everybody, it is the first climate action the federal government has passed, but it's still spending billions to prop up the oil and gas industry with scams like carbon capture. So, there's really not climate solutions coming. And then he turned to tax reform and said, as he said a couple of times during the speech, I'm a capitalist, is what he said. And called for fairer taxes and touted the corporate minimum tax of 15%, which is better than what we had. And then he said, we're not going to increase taxes at all on people earning less than $400,000 a year. That's the top 1.8% of American families. So, it's appealing to the affluent professional middle class and not having a progressive tax reform program that is broadly based and not just strictly on the super rich. He did say he's for quadrupling the tax on stock buybacks, and that's probably a good reform, but that was the extent of it. No wealth tax, no financial transactions tax, not a more progressive personal income tax, more progressive corporate taxes, not repealing the Trump tax cuts. He talks about deficit reduction. That's a huge reason why the deficit has ballooned since Trump got that bill passed. It was just nothing. And there was a lot more that could be done. And then he turned to police reform, and he did call for more social services and economic improvement in impoverished, high crime communities, without being specific, without any particular program. He touted an executive order he passed implementing the provisions of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, but it's only for federal officers. So, it bans chokeholds, bans no-knock warrants, and a number of other things. But the problem is most police brutality and killings are done by local police. And he didn't even mention or call on Congress to pass the full George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which does ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants. It would end qualified immunity. That's really important because right now the cops are exempt from civil lawsuits for the damages they cause. That's what qualified immunity means. It would require that the police wear body cameras. There would be a National Police Misconduct Registry, which would help. And another thing that the bill calls for, you can't rehire cops that are fired for police misconduct and brutality. And it would enhance pattern and practice investigations of police departments, a pattern and practice of discriminatory and abusive policing. So that's all good. It did pass the House in the last session. Of course, the Senate didn't pass it because they got the damn filibuster, and the Republicans can veto it. But he didn't even call on Congress to move on that. He just said, I did it for the federal officers, and left it at that. He did have Tyree Nichols' parents in the gallery, but he made no mention of the other high-profile police killing of Mamopais Terrans, which we've talked about, who was protesting the militarized policing that Cop City, their building in Atlanta, would represent. And of course, Biden has been calling for putting more federal money into such militarized local policing. He didn't, that I remember, tout the money he had gave to the police. And then we got to realize that even with the George Floyd and Policing Act, banning chokeholds doesn't mean much if it's not enforced. Remember Eric Garner, who was choked to death on Staten Island by a police officer, where chokeholds had been banned since, I think, the late 1990s. I think 93. So it was like 20 years, and Eric Garner was killed by a police chokehold. So you can have rules, but if they're not enforced, it doesn't matter. He did call for restricting no-knock warrants, but didn't call for supporting Representative Ilhan Omar's Amir Lock and the End Deadly No-Knock Warrants Act. I mean, there's legislation in the Congress that he didn't point to. But for us, I think we've got to keep highlighting this. What's missing in all this, when it comes to police reform, is community control of the police. If they don't work for us, but work for the power structure that uses the police to enforce the lines of race and class segregation in our cities, which the real estate industry, which is the real money behind municipal politics, in the center of municipal power structures. If we don't challenge that, then the police are going to keep doing what they're doing, and we cannot hold them accountable. So, Biden, when he did talk about the need for crime prevention through social and economic programs, and he mentioned health, housing, education, and employment, but his economic program doesn't provide for it. And so I think we need to keep advocating for an economic bill of rights, the right to a job, an income above poverty, affordable housing, quality comprehensive health care, child care, free public education from child care through public colleges and vocational schools after high school, and a secure retirement. We need real programs, not just talk about these things. And all we got from Biden was some rhetoric. He talked briefly about gun violence and called for a ban on assault weapons. Mentioned that we did have one that he helped pass back in the 90s for 10 years. And that was really after Reagan was shot, and there was a lot of sentiment for that. And, I as a former Marine, I don't want to see weapons like I had, the M16, on the streets. They're designed to kill a lot of people fast. They're not for self-defense or hunting. They don't belong on the streets. So that was good, although whether it can get through the Congress with the majority of Republicans in the House is doubtful. He's touched on immigration and emphasized equipping the officers at the border to secure it. That was the first thing he said. And the Republicans heckled him a little bit, like maybe he wasn't really doing it. He said we need to protect the dreamers, but that's about it. He said nothing about stopping deportations without due process, which his administration is doing at the same rate as the Trump administration. Nothing about giving due process to asylum seekers. In fact, they're getting deported right back to the deadly situations from which they're seeking asylum. And of course, the kind of policy that I've talked about is we need a real open borders policy, like they have in the European Union and many other regions around the world, including in Latin America, so people can move freely back and forth across borders for work, recreation, shopping, residence. There are no border checks when you cross these borders, and where they have this free migration policy. And the people say, well, the drug smugglers and the sex traffickers, how are we going to catch them? They're not checking in at border crossings. They're going around them anyway. So, it's other law enforcement practices that have to deal with those problems, rather than putting that on policing borders, which in our case, our border with Mexico is really like apartheid. The borders are used to enforce economic and political inequalities across borders, just like South Africa used the Bantustans, or Israel's using the West Bank for migrant labor. And, we let them in when we need them, but we send them back when we don't. And that is an exploitative policy that really doesn't help us or them on the other side of the border. It's counter economic development. And of course, freedom of movement is a basic human right, and we should not be violating it. So not much on immigration, where the Biden administration doesn't have a good record. He did briefly talk about protecting abortion rights. He said he would veto a national abortion ban if the Republicans sent it to him. That's not going to happen. It won't get through the Senate. But he made no mention of the bill that would codify the abortion rights in Roe v. Wade. It's called the Women's Health Protection Act. It passed the House in 2021. But Biden made no commitment to that bill. He didn't mention it. He did call for passing the Equality Act, which would include LGBTQ people, as he put it, to ensure LGBTQ Americans, especially transgender young people, can live with safety and dignity. And, the House has passed that, didn't get through the Senate because of the filibuster. You can't criticize Biden on that policy, although you can on not fighting the filibuster, which prevented that from coming into law when the Democrats had both houses. And then he got briefly to foreign and military policy. I'm going to talk a lot more than he did about it. He touted building a coalition to support Ukraine, which I think he's basically done a good job. We're providing arms. We're not providing our own troops in direct combat with the Russians to support the Ukrainians' right to self-determination. I think that's a good policy. And then he turned right away to talk about competing with China. And he said they're threatening our sovereignty, which I think is way overblown. Talked about modernizing the military to deter aggression, and talked about trying to deal with the suicide epidemic among veterans and supporting the VA in that. And that's okay in itself. But where are the real peace policies? You would think, facing a divided Congress, where passing domestic legislation is going to be nearly impossible in the next 2 years, foreign and military policy would be the area where Biden would emphasize the things he could do. And it's where progressive changes need to be made. And he certainly didn't speak out against the imperialist bullying and pervasive militarism that characterizes U.S. foreign and military policy. Treating China as a competitor rather than a potential partner to help resolve, international life and death issues like the climate crisis and the new nuclear arms race is not protecting our security. I'm all for speaking out against China's violation of human and democratic rights, but those criticisms should not be a condition on having discussions on the other issues that are of mutual concern. And instead of treating China like an inevitable adversary, we should treat it like a potential partner and see, how far they are willing to go in dealing with climate and the arms race. Of course, we're going to have to change our policies to go anywhere. Climate, we have cooperated with China in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to block mandatory limits on emissions and to delay the reparations for damage and loss. They did agree in principle at the last COP, but didn't set up a way to have it financed. That was kicked down the road. And for many of these international climate summits, the US and China have worked together to block real climate action. I'm just skipping over. I got a lot of notes here. And so, going back to the Ukraine policy, as I said, I think he's been pretty good. He's supporting Ukraine's just right for self-determination with military and economic aid, not engaging the troops directly. He stated that our U.S. policy is not regime change in Russia, just that Russia should withdraw from Ukraine's territories. I think that's a good policy. But what is missing in the background, this is a national liberation struggle by Ukraine for its self-determination, but there's also in the background inter-imperialist rivalry. Russia's, invaded. It's obviously imperialist in Ukraine, but the U.S. and NATO and the West have pushed neoliberal economic policies on Ukraine, which is an economic imperialism, making it easier to be exploited by the West. And now, if Russia's justification for invading Ukraine is sincere, that it was security concerns, the U.S. should much more aggressively, they've done a little bit, go to Russia and say, okay, let's negotiate mutually acceptable security arrangements for Russia, for across Europe, for Russia and the European countries, and use that as a basis for disarmament, nuclear and conventional. And if Russia's real motivation is, great Russian chauvinism, rebuilding the Russian Empire by recolonizing nations that were once in the Soviet and Tsarist empires, then this diplomatic initiative will further expose Russia's imperialist motivations. But we're not pushing that hard. Both sides have blame in this deteriorating relationship. It was the U.S. that unilaterally withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. And Russia, the U.S. said, well, Russia's violating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Okay, well, use the treaty to get them back within it, rather than just saying, okay, we abandon it and we're going to have an arms race. And Russia, they were the ones that pulled out of the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty back in 2007. And right at the moment, they're refusing to negotiate on START, the Strategic Arms Treaty, which needs to be updated. So, the U.S. should take, very public initiatives challenging Russia to get down and talk about these things. And if we could establish those mutually acceptable security arrangements, that would create an environment which a settlement in Ukraine that was just and enduring would be much more likely. And, if we have the security arrangements, then it becomes much easier for progressive conventional nuclear disarmament. So I may get back to the disarmament thing, but Biden said nothing about, what's going on in Israel and Palestine. The violent expansion of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and all the Arabs that have been killed, which is they're fighting back, not in an organized way, but it's just creating a more volatile and violent situation. And the U.S. is still giving basically unconditional military and diplomatic support for Israel's apartheid policies of occupation and annexation of Palestinian lands. Of course, we advocate BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, starting as the Palestinian National BDS Committee asks us to, with cutting off military aid to Israel until the human and democratic rights of Palestinians are recognized and fulfilled. And then there's the war in Yemen, which Biden said nothing about. The U.S. is still sending military aid and selling arms to the Saudis and Emiratis, who are using them for their war in Yemen. In fact, the aid we've given to them since 2015 is on a scale of what we've committed to give to Ukraine this year and the next few years. $50 billion in military aid over, I think it's more like 55 since 2015 to those two aggressors in Yemen, and $127 billion in arms sales are in the pipeline. Again, Biden said nothing about the U.S. global military empire and all the things it's doing. And, a progressive president, would start to roll those things back. He said nothing in support of the women-led pro-democracy movement in Iran, which is a major global story. And instead allowed, at least permitted or didn't protest, Israeli drone strikes against Iranian military production facilities while these protests are going on. I'm sure the U.S. was notified ahead of time, but they haven't protested. And meanwhile, we're getting reports that the U.S., through its various covert programs, is meddling in the opposition movement in Iran to promote U.S.-friendly leaders. And that's not for the U.S. to do. It's up to the Iranians to decide, who their leaders are and what their program is. The U.S. should express support for the pro-democracy movement, condemn the brutal crackdown by the Iranian regime, including executing people for, protesting, and but keep the hell out of their movement. Let the Iranians decide their future. Which brings us to Syria, where Iran has extensive military intervention. The war there is in its 12th year. And negotiations at this point on Syria's political future are being conducted by other foreign interveners, of which there are many: Iran, Russia, and Turkey, in particular, without the U.S., without opposition forces, including the left-wing Kurdish forces, now governing Rojava, which is what they call northeastern Syria. That is not who needs to be at the table to get a real political solution. And despite the apparent conflict between Russia and the U.S. over Syria, they in fact coordinate in fighting ISIS, where the U.S. took the lead, and Al-Qaeda affiliates, where Russia is fighting them in Idlib province. But they cooperate. The U.S. couldn't have taken out ISIS and Al-Qaeda leaders in Idlib, where the Russians control the skies, without Russian cooperation that allowed us to go in there and do those missions. And Israel would not have been able to make hundreds of airstrikes over the last couple of years against Iranian military assets in Syria without the cooperation of the Russians and the Americans, who control the western and eastern skies respectively. Now, Iran and Russia see themselves as competitors for making money in the Syrian reconstruction after the war. So it's a very complicated situation. But the U.S. should be pushing hard diplomatically for a political solution that includes the opposition forces. And instead, they're just letting that process go on without them. They've diplomatically disengaged, and basically just, I think it's about 500 troops they've got deployed with the Kurdish forces to fight ISIS, which is not all we should be doing. We should be there promoting a diplomatic solution. And then in Africa, the U.S. continues to pursue a militarized approach in the so-called war on terror in Africa, with AFRICOM establishing military bases in cooperation with most African states. And they're in competition with the Russians. The Wagner Group, their mercenaries, are now working with the dictators of Sudan, Mali, Central African Republic, and probably Burkina Faso. And in return for providing security for those dictators, they're getting mining concessions. And that's, economic imperialism right there. And the Chinese are there as well with their investments. Now, the insurgencies in many of these African countries, and some are Islamic fundamentalists, but others are just rural peoples, they exist because the autocratic and corrupt governments in those countries are not solving social problems. And so the U.S. should be much more focused on economic development and incentivizing anti-corruption reforms than militarizing their intervention by just using the military to fight Islamic insurgents. So there's a lot that can be done on Africa policy, not mentioned. Africa is always never thought of or discussed when it comes to the State of the Union. In terms of global economic foreign policy, Biden did tout or really didn't tout, the global corporate minimum tax that many countries agreed to back in October, but he didn't get Congress to approve it when the Democrats had both houses of Congress. So that's probably why he didn't mention it. And then there's another problem, huge problem, of tax havens, where the world's super rich are hiding their money in offshore tax havens. The Democratic platform in 2020, called for eliminating that, but Biden is not pushing the multilateral action that's needed to shut them down. And it's something certainly a Green administration would pursue aggressively because, that money should be reinvested in our various nations' development rather than sitting offshore avoiding taxes. Another issue is the authorization to use military force since 2001. That allows the president basically to go to war anywhere if he can say it's against the war on terror. It's against terrorists. It's a big loophole which enables the president to get around the War Powers Act, which restates what the Constitution says, is that only Congress can declare wars. So, a big issue is restoring the constitutional balance where Congress has the war powers and the president would execute them if we declare war. But we've been fighting war after war after war. Last declared war was World War II. It's a real problem. And of course, Biden didn't address that. And then, what are the real security threats that we face? It's climate change. It's the new nuclear arms race. And it's infectious diseases. I mean, COVID is the one now, but, the scientists keep warning us that there are more likely diseases that are going to come into spread among humans from animals that we come into contact and disrupt their habitats. And so, this is something that's on the horizon beyond COVID. Instead, the U.S. failed to support the waiver on patents for COVID vaccines that South Africa and India pushed at the World Trade Organization. Biden did say he was for that, but then we know from reporting that behind the scenes at those meetings, the U.S. was supporting the other countries with big pharma companies like Germany and the UK and the Netherlands in not lifting those vaccine patents. Which is, bad economic policy in terms of promoting equality, but also just bad public health policy. And as I mentioned in the COP27, as well as earlier climate summits, no mandated emission cuts, no funding for loss and damage, which they reluctantly recognized. So, on the climate front, we're not really addressing that security threat. And then we've got this new nuclear arms race, which the U.S. really kicked off under Obama with this multi-trillion-dollar, multi-decade, really, nuclear modernization of our nuclear weapons, including hypersonic missiles, which are six times faster than the speed of sound. I mean, they're so fast that no longer can, it undermines deterrence because they're so fast, you can't launch a retaliatory strike, which is the deterrent when you spot a first strike, because that first strike is so fast it could wipe out your response. So that puts the nukes on a hair trigger, and the slightest provocation or fear that they're going to wipe out your nukes first might push you to launch your nukes first. And that's where we're headed with these hypersonic missiles. Now, there are many, and we've talked about it during the campaign. There are disarmament initiatives that the U.S. could take without undermining its security or its deterrent at all. We could declare no first use, which is China's policy, although they're rethinking it in this new nuclear arms race. It's India's policy. It's not Russia's policy, but It's not the U.S. policy, but that's something we could do. Put that out there. Eliminate the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are really just targets. That's what a first strike would try to wipe out. It makes us a target. And with these hypersonic missiles coming on, those are already on hair trigger alert. It just makes the hair trigger more sensitive. We could get rid of them. We still got the submarine and air launched missiles. We don't need those intercontinental ballistic missiles. But taking that disarmament initiative could open up the space for diplomatic initiatives to begin talking about, as I mentioned earlier. Well, I'm not sure I did, but with the withdrawal of the Russians from the conventional armed forces in Europe treaty, we should push for pan-European mutual security arrangements among the U.S. and NATO countries and Russia. Doing these peace initiatives like no first use could begin to create an environment where we could really talk about that. We need to recommit and force the Russians to come back to the table on START, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which is goes out of effect in 2026. The last version of which they agreed to under the Obama administration was just renewed, and it's obsolete in a lot of respects, even though it's renewed for 5 years. It needs to be updated, and those negotiations need to restart. The U.S. should say we were wrong to get out of the ABM, INF, and Open Skies treaties, and say we're ready to talk about reestablishing those treaties. Those are bilateral with the Russians. And then as we make these disarmament initiatives and these peace policies, we should also push all the nuclear powers to come to the table so we can all get into the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which over 100 countries have now approved, and is really what we need to do. That's the way to get to nuclear disarmament. But Biden talked about none of this stuff. It was just a little bit about Ukraine and China, and then he moved on. And as I said at the top, you would think, given that he's going to have a difficult time getting domestic programs through this Republican House, that foreign policy would be where he could stand out and make some changes. But apparently he's happy with U.S. imperialism as it is, and that's a problem. So finally he wrapped up, and man, I've been going a while, haven't I? Talking about democracy, and concluded with pro-democracy rhetoric, but very little substance. Of course, he condemned the January 6th coup attempt, but then immediately restated that he seeks bipartisanship on these democracy questions with the party that tried to carry out the coup. He said at that point, the state of our union is strong when it's obvious that it's divided, and we got a fascistic far right that has a lot of power, disproportionate to its real support. And he has no program for dealing with that. And as I said before, you don't fight fascism by accommodating and cooperating with it. You defeat it. So he called, and this is just a ritual, for protecting voting rights. But of course, he failed to do that when the Democrats had both houses, and they had to lift the filibuster. And he did little. He whined about it a couple of times, but really didn't fight to get it lifted for voting rights. And then, of course, he said nothing about what we talk about a lot, and that is changing the electoral rules that produce an exclusive, exclusionary two-capitalist party system. So the Greens need to lead the pro-democracy movement, not only for voting rights and honest elections, but for electoral rules that will yield an inclusive multi-party democracy. Ranked choice voting to end the spoiler problem and the wasted vote problem. And ranked choice voting in multi-member districts to create proportional representation of legislative bodies, which will end partisan and racial gerrymandering, which everybody talks about. And these independent commissions really don't change that much. California, for example, they got 52 House districts. Only 5 of them were competitive after an independent commission drew the lines. So most of our districts are one-party districts because of our single-member district winner-take-all system. And it enforces this two-capitalist party system that includes the Green and Socialist left from the representation we would have if people could vote for us without worrying about the spoiler problem. So no mention of proportional representation. How about abolish the electoral college and replace it with a ranked choice national popular vote? It's actually popular among the public, but the Democrats and Biden aren't talking about it. He said nothing about the problem of private funding of our elections by the super rich and giant corporations and replacing it with a full public campaign finance program. You know, it's ironic, and maybe Biden didn't even notice because it's a leftover from the 90s when it was more popular. But he had on his website campaign platform, first thing under campaign finance, he said he would support a constitutional amendment to ban private funding of campaign elections. And he didn't say much during the campaign, and not a word since he was elected. He ended up supporting this matching fund system, which was part of the Democrats' electoral reform bill, H.R. 1, which never passed anyway. So, you know, the Greens really need to take the lead on voting rights, honest elections, and these pro-democracy reforms that would create an inclusive multi-party democracy. So to wrap up here, and sorry it took so long, I'm not leaving a lot of time for questions and comments, but I figured I'd give my response to Biden. He took an hour and 15 minutes, so I've been a little more succinct. So Biden changed his rhetorical posture for the Democrats from neoliberalism to the old New Deal liberalism. But the substantive policy, while it's socially liberal on questions of race, gender, and sexual orientation, economically, it's really some of the neoliberalism and a lot of just corporate liberalism, where public programs are run through the corporate sector or programs are run through the corporate sector rather than the public sector. So, you know, economic programs like for healthcare and climate action, it's contracts, subsidies, and tax breaks for big business rather than public agencies that can run these programs at cost for less cost to us, but universal coverage. And this corporate liberalism is not going to end the growing inequality, militarism, and environmental destruction that flow from the competition-driven, built-in system of exploitation and blind growth that is capitalism. So the differences with the Republicans on that is they're just more stingy on public subsidies for private business to implement government programs. Wealthy special interest private money still dominates campaign funding and lobbying, and the Republicans agree with that. They just want less regulation of the financing and lobbying. U.S. militarism and imperialism is unchallenged, and by the Democrats, and the Republicans agree with that, although their far right wing wants to ally with Russia because they like its authoritarian strongman rule and social conservatism, but they want to be more aggressive toward China's state-directed capitalism, which they call communism. And so does the Chinese capitalists. So I think it's important that we have to recognize there are differences between the corporate liberalism of the Democrats and the fascistic corporate authoritarianism of the Republicans. You know, you could say the Democrats are less evil between the two. That's probably just an objective fact from our point of view, but that doesn't mean we should support it, because that is still a road to increasing inequality, wars, and climate cases. We need to advance our own program on these life and death issues. It needs to be an eco-socialist program for real political and economic democracy, so we have the democratic power to carry through, implement these solutions to the climate inequality and militarism problems, despite the resistance of the corporate power structure. So if you're still with me, I welcome your questions and comments. I see there are 88 messages in the chat. And okay, Chris Blankenhorn, the tone only ever comes into centering the working class when the Democrats don't control both houses. Where was this when they had control of both houses and the White House? I'm trying to think when the last time the working class was centered by the Democratic leadership. It certainly wasn't under Clinton and Obama. Look at candidates like Dukakis and Mondale, Kerry. I mean, they were all a neoliberal rhetoric. I think the transition was Carter, and he really, he was more. I think that's where the Democrats started reorienting to the educated middle class as opposed to the blue collar working class. And where was this when they had control of both houses in the White House? Yeah, well, as I tried to describe, the programs that they're implementing really aren't working class programs. They are what we used to call corporate liberalism. It's they want to provide some programs to deal with some of these problems, but they run it through big business with privatized delivery of services through contracts, incentivizing it through tax breaks and subsidies. So I don't see. This is really the first time a Democratic leader since, God, you really have to go back maybe to Humphrey. I mean, McGovern was also kind of transitional. He was not good at articulating what the working class, aspired to. His policy platform was more in that direction. He was a New Deal Democrat, but even rhetorically, back then the big issue was the Vietnam War and civil rights, and that's where the cultural divides within the working class, became a bigger problem. So anyway, I think the middle class orientation of the Democrats goes back a long way. Leftists of Louisiana, do you like Hakeem? I think you're referring to Hakeem Jeffries. Hell no. I mean, he goes out of his way to attack, the left, progressive Democrats. He has a PAC that finances challengers to progressive Democrats. He's a former corporate lawyer. He won his district against a left-leaning Democrat named Charles Barron, overwhelmed Barron with corporate money. He's just what the corporations ordered to lead the Democratic Party. He's no change from Pelosi. Andrew Hager, I'm sorry to go off topic suddenly, but have you heard the news about the disastrous train wreck that happened this week? Two of them, Ohio earlier in the week, and then I understand this morning in Pennsylvania, there was another one. And that, I think, just speaks to the need to get the rail system out of the hands of these greedy corporations who are cutting back on staffing and safety, working people overtime, making it hard to get sick leave days off. It's just setting up a situation where these accidents are going to happen. We have them here in New York, CSX line running across upstate New York. They're frequent accidents. We haven't had accidents as bad as happened in Ohio and what I understand happened in Pennsylvania this morning. But we need to bring the whole railroad system under public control, public ownership, and democratic control, so that we can have a first-rate freight and passenger rail system, transition it to electrification powered by renewable energy, and just upgrade it. I mean, we have among the industrially rich industrial countries, we have probably the worst rail system of any of them. And that's because, and these industries are enormously profitable. I can't remember the number, but their profit rate was something like 50% last year. And they're spending those profits on stock buybacks rather than upgrading their equipment and paying their workers. So, it's time to socialize the rail industry, bring it under democratic control, and through that public control, modernize and ecologize, I guess you could say, our rail transport systems. Violeted Content Boutique. Howie, is it true that heat pump systems can be unreliable in cold, snowy regions? I don't think that's true. It's certainly not true. Everybody I know around here that has a heat pump system, no problems. Um, the only problem that you can have is if the power goes out because of a blizzard or something like that, or ice storm, and then they're powered by electricity. Um, so that's really the only problem I can think of. And once you've covered the cost of installing them, it saves you a lot of money because you don't have to keep buying gas or heating oil. So no, the heat pumps are where we need to go. Amy L. Sachs. For any other Oregon residents hanging around, there will be an online accessible hearing about statewide public health care happening Monday, February 13th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. If you want to if there is a link to that in the chat, we'll put it on the screen for people so they can participate. But thanks for that. Amy L. Sachs, don't know if I can post a link, but searching Oregon Senate Committee on Healthcare should get you where you need to go. Okay, so it's a public hearing. Frankie Lee, Amy says, I don't know if it's available on YouTube, but it's a Zoom meeting open to the public. And Oregon residents can submit a statement up to 48 hours before the meeting's over. So there's still time. Okay, great. So yeah, make your voices heard. And, we're not going to get Medicare for all through this House for sure. And probably this Democratic Party, because they're committed to the privatized system of Obamacare. So we got to, I think, do it at the state level, show it works well, and then we can bring it back to the national level with good evidence to show it covers everybody and it costs less. Yeah, I see a comment here from Don Osborne. Have you visited UK trains? Yeah, there you go. They're a joke due to being privatized. Yeah, that's the legacy of Thatcher and neoliberalism. Same thing's happening to their National Health Service. I mean, it's one thing to get it, but if the right comes back in and undermines your public services and assets, you got a problem. So you got to be vigilant. It's politics. Democracy is a continuous game. It's not something you win and then you can go home from. Violet at Content Boutique. My HVAC fella said this area is too cold for heat pumps. Then I saw an article that said current HVAC techs just don't want to do it. I think that article is probably right. They're familiar with setting up the heating and air conditioning systems that are the old school ones that run off of furnaces, and they're just not familiar with the heat pumps. And some of them don't even know how to link up the heat pumps to the vents. So I think that article is probably right. And but there are other. I expect there are other vendors that are learning that and willing to provide the service. So you just got to find out who they are. And these retrograde HVAC techs are just going to have to catch up if they want to stay in business. I see an interesting comment. I'm going a little longer if the man behind the screen can, because I took so long to present. And I'm sure there's some questions about what I said or comments on it. I see Frankie Lee says we'll never get Medicare for all under capitalism, and Britain no longer has free NHS. Yeah, they're privatizing. They're adding fees, copays, and things like that in Britain. But I would say, capitalism can accommodate public agencies that provide public services universally, because we do have many countries with national health insurance programs. So capitalism can live with that. And in fact, a lot of capitalists would prefer that because, uh, particularly, smaller companies, because it's a lot of work to, get an insurance plan for your employees. I did this as part of a food co-op we started. And, they gave us this big binder of all these different policies we could offer our employees, and we couldn't make heads or tails of it. We finally had to ask the people from the health insurance company, well, you pick, what do you think makes sense? And then we looked at that and kind of did make sense. It was expensive. And in the end, our employees decided they couldn't afford it. But that, if you just take that off the table, healthcare is covered. And if you're running a business, you don't have to worry about it. Same thing for the unions. It takes it off the bargaining table. Your people are covered by a good program, a public program, and then you can focus on bargaining for better wages and working conditions and pensions and other benefits. So, what I'm arguing is that some of the capitalists would prefer to have the medical system just publicly run. So I think this is something we don't have to have a socialist transformation to get universal health care. So I think we should keep fighting, for those reforms like they are up in Oregon. And we are here in New York. Vicky Corden, Democrats are too weak to fight those fascist Republicans. It is scary. Those fascists are being financed by billionaires. Yeah, the Democrats have their billionaires, but the Republicans have theirs as well. And it is scary because you're in a two-party system that's structured that way by biased electoral laws that exclude other political persuasions. And so it's unchallenged. And the Democrats' instinct is, Biden's. We work across the aisle, even if these people would cut our throats in an alley if they could. So yeah, it's a scary situation, and that's why I disagree with those who say to stop the Republicans, we got to settle for the Democrats, even though we don't really like them. What was that slogan some of them were saying in open letters to tell me not to run in 2020? It was beat Trump, then fight Biden, something like that. But how about putting forward our own program and building support for that? And the more support we get, the more the Democrats are going to have to lean our way to compete with the people that are voting for us, to compete for the people voting for us. I've said many times, on this podcast and elsewhere, how when we got 5% of the vote for governor in 2014 against Andrew Cuomo, who wanted to run up the vote, get ready to run for president, get more than his father, Mario Cuomo, ever got, more than he got when he was first elected in 2010, and he got less because we got 5%. And he had to see what we were talking about in order to compete for our voters. And out of that, we got a ban on fracking. We got a higher minimum wage, and we got paid family leave. Now, the minimum wage and the paid family leave and even the fracking was not as far as we would have gone, but we moved the debate and we moved policy, even with just 5% of the vote leveraging those changes. So, if we don't speak up for what we want, nobody else is, and we end up disappearing. We get, what was my phrase? We get lost in the sauce. If you vote for a Biden and you want Medicare for all, nobody's going to know that because he's against Medicare for all. Lon Boy Wilson, Medicare sucks. Fully socialized medicine is the answer. $10,000 a night for a hospital bed, no end. Yeah, that's the problem. You're hitting it with that $10,000 a night. The hospitals are private, and they tend to be monopolies. And so they basically can charge whatever they can get the insurance companies to pay or the Medicare system to pay. Yeah, and Medicare doesn't cover all medically necessary services. So it's very limited. Things like eye care and hearing aids, they don't cover that. They don't cover drugs. So, yeah, Medicare is very limited. And yep, the National Health Service that socializes not just the insurance payments, but the delivery system and brings the doctors and nurses. They become public employees under the direction of elected community health boards so that the system is accountable to the people. That's what we need. And, I think it's one of the things the Greens can lead on and move the debate for universal health care from national health insurance, which they call Medicare for all, to a national health service. Amy L. Sachs. I also noticed locally that our Democratic Representative Blumenauer sent a mass email in support of reparations for Black, Indigenous people of color. No credit to the Green Party, of course, and no actual plan cited. Sigh. Yeah, I think the reparations question, it's Black History Month. Maybe you thought this was a good time to say that. We have moved the needle on that debate, although we're far from getting any real program. The one piece of legislation that deals with that, which goes back to something John Conyers, I believe, introduced in the 80s, calls for a commission to study how to do reparations. And that's important because the people who would receive the reparations need to speak for themselves as to what they need. Is it just a check to everybody, or is it collective institutions that build the Black community, which is what the original reparations demands that were announced at the church down there in New York City, where King gave a speech. I'm blanking on the name, but it's a famous church, big church. And that was James Foreman, who would come out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was demanding money for Black media companies and educational institutions and a land bank in the South where Black people had lost so much farmland and collective institutions like that. So what would be the mix of individual and collective reparations? All that needs to be studied so you can come up with a decent reparations plan. That's the bill on the table. And Blumenauer didn't mention it. Of course, Biden didn't mention it. At this point, it's still a good idea. But the fact that Blumenauer had to mention it, felt he had to mention it in a mass email, I think shows we've moved the needle a little bit on that discussion. Via email, comments on the earthquake in Turkey, Syria. What role would an eco-socialist administration play in such disasters? Well, we would do, the U.S., I think, has been pretty good. They lifted any sanctions that would interfere with the delivery of aid to the parts of Syria affected. The problem is the Syrian government wants everything to run through them. The Russians support that. So aid, coming through Turkey, it's the one corridor for humanitarian aid to Idlib, which is the most seriously affected province in Syria. The two problems there. One is the Russians really they want all the aid to come through the Syrian government. And then the other thing is that road has been severely damaged. So there's a lot of problems. The U.S. has military assets there with equipment and things that could help people on the ground. They've offered it to Turkey. And I'm not sure if they've offered it directly to Syria, but they certainly lifted the sanctions so that aid can come into that part of Syria. So those are the kind of things we would do, we should do. Death toll is over 25,000 now. It's a complete disaster. And, one thing I'll comment on is a lot of those buildings in Turkey were built by developers who didn't build the code, which requires some earthquake resistant structures. And it's resulted in a lot of deaths. I think I heard yesterday that a developer in Turkey has been arrested for that. So I think in terms of rebuilding, things got to be built so they're earthquake resistant. I mean, those building collapses is what killed most people. Okay, I think the man behind the screen is ready to go. So we got about almost half hour of questions and comments. Um, I hope, the length I took about Biden's State of the Union address, you know, helped you understand, what the administration is doing and where it falls short. I'm gonna answer one more question I see in the chat from Jesse Motes. Howie, are you going to run for the Green Party nomination for president again in 2024? And the answer to that is I don't know. It's a huge undertaking. You got to pull together a campaign team. You got to raise the money to support them. It's a huge job to get on the ballot. The Green Party is not well organized to do that. It goes state by state. I don't want to run a half-ass campaign. There are other, I'm evaluating, can I make a better contribution by writing and communicating and organizing on other issues locally rather than running for president. On the other hand, they're good reasons to run. I don't see anybody else in the Green Party ready to run a serious campaign. We got a debate in the Green Party on whether we're going to be against all imperialisms or just against U.S. imperialism and not support the Ukrainian struggle for national liberation. I think that's a big issue. That would be a reason for me, getting into the race. But at this point, it's more the organizational things that I haven't worked through yet. I'm doing some other work on Ukraine solidarity and some things I got to take care of, for my own, personal issues and life. So it's going to be a while before I, do a serious evaluation. But I would say, if I did run, it would be the same themes plus one more. The themes last time were eco-socialist Green New Deal to deal with the climate crisis and the inequality crisis through an economic bill of rights, and then peace policies, peace initiatives to deal with the new nuclear arms race and, all the threats to peace. So in addition to that, I would say inclusive democracy. I'd have a fourth theme, and that would focus on ranked choice voting, proportional representation, replacing the electoral college with the ranked choice national popular vote for president. I think we got to lead on that because the Republicans are attacking our democratic rules and institutions, and the Republicans are doing that, and the Democrats are feckless in fighting back. And we got to take the initiative on that. So if it's not me, I hope whoever runs will run on those issues. So that's the best I can tell you at this point. Stay tuned. So just to wrap up, let me urge people, and the website was down, it'll come back up soon. The Green Socialist Organizing Project, which sponsors this video and is trying to advance Green Socialist politics. We're now set up. We need members to support, our activities, including just the internet and online and technical, digital support so we can communicate. And there should be a link to that coming up in the chat. And then the Ukraine Solidarity Network, link to that should come in. I urge people to look at the statement and consider becoming part of that network. And then there's an event that network's putting on for Saturday, February 25th, the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, called Russia Out, Solidarity with the Ukrainian Resistance. And it will have 2 Ukrainian socialists, one who came up in the Donbass region, one who's from Western Ukraine, a Russian socialist, anti-war activist who just fled into exile His name's Kirill Medvedev. And then, the socialists from Ukraine are Yulia Yurchenko, who I had on this podcast, and Vladislav Strbatsov, or something. His last name I'm not pronouncing quite right, but he's the guy from the Donbass. And also a Syrian pro-democracy activist. And we'll be talking about international solidarity and how to really put it in practice and why. So that event is coming up, and I want to give you early notice on that. There it is in the chat. So I appreciate people. Oh, and then here's another one. We're going to have a discussion on Ukraine with Matt Ho and Margaret Kimberly and myself, who all have different perspectives. And we're going to have a constructive debate, not the kind of name calling we get online, which isn't advancing anybody's knowledge really. So that's coming up on Thursday, February 23rd. So there's a lot coming up, and I appreciate people being here today. And I'll be back here next week. So have a good week.